Nice.
All right, yeah, that's Sunday. Man, I'm excited about starting this new series through the Gospel of Mark. And I'm already a couple sermons into it. And this week we'll just introduce it and introduce you to Mark so you know a little bit about his background. But the first chapter, as we get into, of course, I was thinking about both in the men's meeting and men's Bible study, as well as when Greg was teaching us, spending some time talking about the character of John the Baptist. And I've done a lot of extra study that goes around that, because there's a big difference between John's baptism, Jesus's baptism, and then what we practice as believers' baptism as an ordinance of the church. All three of those things are different. And so I think a lot of people don't realize that there is a difference between those three things, and at least I'm counting on that. So, but I'm looking forward to teaching that. So that's going to be coming up here as we kick that off this Sunday. All right. Well, we're back to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Of course, we've been navigating through chapters 8 and 9 with basically the same subject, which is talking about stewardship, it's talking about giving. And of course, the major example of this is the churches at Macedonia. Remember them? There is Thessalonica. There is two others. What is it? Philippi, and then what was the third one? Can't remember. No. It begins with a Berea. Berea. Yeah, Berea. I know I'd get it there soon enough. So Paul had written about this offering that they were taking up for the Jerusalem church at least a year prior to writing the second letter here to the Corinthians. And it was an offering that the Corinthian church was going to be a part of. But of course, they got kind of waylaid in this because they had some problems in the church. And that's one of the reasons why Paul wrote that first letter, as he referred to it as the severe letter. And he was kind of anxious about the idea, well, boy, I hope they take this in the right spirit. You know, I wept over this. It just broke my heart. And I want them to just do the right thing and experience the blessing of God. He didn't know how they were going to respond. So I understand that from a pastoral perspective sometimes. You have things that you have to communicate to people, and you hope you're going to take them, they're going to take them things in the right spirit and all the rest of it. And of course, what he comes back with in 2 Corinthians is, yes, they did. They had the right spirit. They got right with God. They straightened out the things that were wrong. And so now they're back on board with the collection of this offering. And of course, another key player in this is Titus. And I think Titus is an extremely key player, because remember, one of the problems and challenges that Paul was having was these Judaizers that followed him around from place to place where he would preach the gospel, and they would come in behind him and try to undo everything that he tried to do. I was thinking about that young man that asked the question and answer at Alistair Begg. Remember, he said, I'm a new pastor, pastoring for, I think he said a couple of years in a church in Jessup, Maryland. And he said, everything I preach, he says, I preach, and then I have a couple of deacons go around behind me and just kind of undo everything that I preach. Now, in this open forum, 1,200 men, and Pastor Begg is there trying to answer this question. I thought he did a beautiful job of it, because he said, you know, a couple things. He says, I don't know your deacons. And he said, I don't know you. You might be a jerk. I don't know. You know, so he can only answer it in a general sense. And of course, the idea of just continuing to preach the truth and pray, that's very important as well. But the fact that these people were following him around and spreading lies about him, one of the things in regards to the offering would have been that, okay, well, Paul's a Jew. He's trying to raise money for the Jerusalem church. You know, he's just trying to play off the resources of these Gentile churches for the sake of his Jewish buddies. Well, the fact that he had Titus involved, Titus was a Gentile. And so that was very key. The Gentile churches had a great deal of confidence. They really didn't lack confidence in Paul, even though the false accusations. But at the same time, they would have felt even more reassured by having Titus as a part of this. And we're going to see tonight, he talks about another brother And it doesn't give us the guy's name. So we don't know who he is. I'll give some suggestions just in regards to some of the other people that Paul tends to mention when he's writing these letters to these various churches. And then he talks about the importance of the brethren from those individual churches as well. As I mentioned, we started this last week because it goes from chapter 8, verse 10, all the way through chapter 9, verse 5. And we went through the first four. We are to give voluntarily, faithfully, proportionately, and expectantly. And if you didn't get the first part of that, you can always go back to either YouTube or Facebook, and that is recorded there. And thankfully, last week, I got back to getting this thing to work again. And so that was recorded. So we're picking up on number 5. We are to give submissively. This is in the 8th chapter in verses 16 and 17. So that's where we want to pick up tonight. Paul says in these verses, he says, "But thanks be to God, who puts the same earnestness on your behalf in the heart of Titus. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being myself very earnest, he has gone to you of his own accord." And so here's the idea of the fact that, again, Titus's involvement is, I think, really key to making this happen as far as bringing it together. And, Paul is not even really flexing his apostolic authority in regards to this offering. He did in the first letter according to the correction that the church needed to hear, without a doubt. But here it's the idea that he wants, look, God has put this same earnestness. In other words, there is a sense of unity in what we realize, that we're submitting ourselves to God through this act of stewardship that will benefit the churches that are involved. It's not just Paul, but Titus. And the church was very, very close to Titus. Back in chapter 7 of 2 Corinthians, verse 15, it says, "His affection abounds all the more towards you as he remembers the obedience of you all, how you received him with fear and trembling." So he's got this hands-on relationship to the church at Corinth. And so this is going to really come together. Titus was not coerced by Paul, but had gone to Corinth, there it says, of his own accord. And he determined this on his own. So here's the application to that. Really, for God's work to progress, and for there to be good stewardship, there has to be submission to spiritual leadership. That's more issue now than it's ever been, because when it comes to any sense of authority, boy, there's just a lot of resistance when it comes to that. Hebrews 13:7 says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you." And so, God has established a lot of different levels of authority. We know that even God, I had mentioned this from our morning Bible study as we've been going through the book of Deuteronomy, Romans chapter 13, God even established human government. You say, well, human government is really messed up. Yeah, that's because it's human government. But God established the authority. And even the ones who, he says, look, those who are in authority and they carry that kind of authority, he says they don't bear the sword in vain. They should be operating under certain guidelines and principles. We know there's corruption in anything that man gets his hands in. So that's, but God established human government. And God also established authority or leadership in the church. Now, it's important to understand ecclesiastical leadership, because too often, and there have been times when churches begin to operate more by the secular business pattern than they do according to biblical pattern. We're not CEOs. That's not what we do. Jesus made it very clear. He says, your leadership will involve not how many people that you are over, but really how many people you are under, because it is servant leadership. And so understanding the nature of that, but there is authority that goes along with it. And that leaders have to give an account to God for the leadership of the church. That's exactly what Hebrews 13 says. And God holds everyone else accountable to give, but once he holds the leaders accountable for how those resources are used. And we'll talk more about that in a few moments. We move to number 6, which is we are to give trustfully. This is in verses 18 through 23. This is the largest portion that we have in any one point here. But in verse 18, he says, we have sent along with him, this is Titus, the brother whose fame in this thing, in the things of the gospel, has spread through all the churches. Not only this, but he also been appointed by the churches to travel with us in this gracious work, which is being administrated by us for the glory of the Lord himself, and to show our readiness, taking precautions so that no one will discredit us in our administration of the generous gift. For we have regard for what is honorable, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. We have sent with them our brother, whom we have often tested and found diligent in many things, but now even more diligent because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker among you. As for our brethren, they are messengers of the church, a glory to Christ. And so I really wish he would have told us who this guy was, but he didn't. And then, of course, in the very last part of this, in verse 23, he includes the fact that our brethren, there's a plurality of leadership going on in this church when it comes to the collection of this offering and the stewardship, the responsibility of the stewardship to the church. And so it makes it very clear, we could ask all night long, who was this brother who was well known to all the churches? Well, we're not told. Some of the commentators will, because I said, you've read the Pauline letters a lot of times, particularly as he's closing out the letters, he'll mention a number of people who are connected with his ministry or people that ministered with him in particular churches. And so some suggest it could be people like Tychicus or Trophimus, even Luke or Apollos, but in reality, we don't know. It could have been any number of people, but it was somebody who was well known among the churches and highly respected. And he was appreciated by the Corinthians. That's just a smart move. Was obviously a man of character, integrity, and spiritual maturity. And then I think it's interesting, you notice the offering would not be handled just by Paul or by Paul and Titus, and really not even just by this well-known brother, but the brethren. A plurality of godly men. And so that's very, very important to understand the nature of the stewardship of the church. And there ought to be in management more than just one person who's overseeing that type of responsibility. That can be very difficult. I know of a particular church. That was a small church, a lot smaller than ours. And the pastor just really, pastor dissolved any sense of leadership that was in the church after he came into it, saying that none of the leaders were qualified by his standard to be leaders. And then he was just taking control of one thing after another. And the final straw for that little congregation was, and he just wanted to take over the finances completely as well without any accountability. Well, they were right to put a stop to that, because there has to be a mutual accountability in regards, especially when it comes to financial management in the church. You see a biblical example in Acts chapter 4, verse 37. We understand when the church was in that infancy stage and many people were pulling their resources together. What did they do with their resources? They brought them and laid them at the apostles' feet. they said, we're going to allow you guys as the leaders to manage this and distribute it among us. We see this unnamed brother was appointed by the churches to travel, he says, with us in this gracious work. Paul had not appointed this man, but had been recommended by the other churches. That says a lot in regards to Paul's response to this. And then in verse 19, it says that the gift administered by us for the glory of the Lord himself. He understood that the greatest responsibility they had was managing this according to the fact that it was for the Lord's work. And that's why he says in verse 20, he's very careful. He says we've got to take this precaution that no one will discredit us. We want to make sure that everything is above board. I mentioned that last week, the importance of transparency. And that's what we do here. We really try to do that to the best of our ability. And we've come a long way on that. If you probably go back and when we were cleaning up last week, and I was in that Sunday school closet. I think Colton was with me there. And they got a first-hand look at that safe. That's probably 200 years old or better, And he said, man, what's in that? I said, there's records going back to 1836 when this church was founded. The book in there is the one that you open up that lists the charter members of this church. And then the books go forward. Now, when the safe got full, we've got other boxes stacked in other places and stuff. And we have annual reports going back for as far as you can remember. Now, some of the books are the older ones are very difficult to read. They're probably writing with, not being funny, but probably with inkwell and a quill. And they had beautiful handwriting, but it's like Morse code. It can be hard to read. But you can go back and read that, and our budget was a lot simpler when I got here 20 years ago than it is now. And I think we had two categories. We had pastor's salary and general fund. I think that was pretty much it. But through the years, we've gotten more detail on that because why? We want people to see what you're investing in, where these funds are going to, and how they're being applied in the different areas. And I think that's extremely important that that is something that is before the people. And so churches, of course, operate differently, but all churches must have a plurality of trustworthy people to oversee the finances and provide financial accountability to the people who give their money to the service of the Lord. And I think that's really important. Some pastors handle that in different ways. In reality, no, I try to stay more distant from that. I don't like handling money. I don't like. I just soon not be attached to any of it because I don't want it to come back on me. I know some churches, maybe more than some, who know exactly what everybody in the church gives. I don't do that. I don't see the need to do that. Now, I am interested in the deposit numbers because that's a reflection of our stewardship. And are we being faithful in giving? Are we, where are the numbers at? As I mentioned that in the first quarter this year, our giving was just over $70,000 in the first quarter. Well, that tells me we're in a healthy place. We really are. And so I do need to keep a sense of that. But again, we have a plurality of trustworthy people who handle this stuff, and I'll reference that again in just a moment. Number 7 is verse 24 of chapter 8. We are to give lovingly. He says, therefore, openly before the churches, show them the proof of your love and of the reason for boasting about you. Paul's been bragging on them. He said, boy, I wrote a tough letter to you, didn't know how you were going to receive it. You took it well. You're getting things right. Now you want to be a part of this offering. And he said, I can't say enough good about you. I just brag about it. And I have, now the subject didn't really come up while we're at Basics Conference. I know at Jacksonville at times I have talked to some guys. And it's easy for me to boast about the stewardship of this church. Always has been. But I've sat and had conversations with people who we're going through some difficult times in the churches financially, you know, and almost to the point of where, you know, they would ask me, well, what's the size of your church and what's your giving like? And I'm thinking, man, I don't want to make your burden worse, because I'm going to tell you, there's something unique about what we've got going on. And I said, I don't want to crush you, you know. And I remember one guy, it was a black gentleman who was sitting next to me. I think he had his assistant with him. And he said, well, how big's your church? And I told him at that time it wasn't nearly what we're running now. He said, well, what's your budget? How much money you got? I told him. He said, how's that again? And I told him. He turned to his companion. He said, I got to go back and preach about stewardship. We've got to do something. Something's got to, you know, get, because they had a lot more people in their membership than we did. And they weren't seeing nearly the stewardship that we were seeing in our church. So I said, well, listen, I said, it's something that God does, and it has to be a movement of God. I said, don't get up there and browbeat your people or try to coerce them into get, you know, it's got to be something that God moves in the hearts of people. But to give lovingly. And again, the gift was seen openly before the churches. This would be proof of your love. In other words, he says, this is a demonstration of the fact that you have a love for the brother. And that's very important to understand. Again, the only questions that I've asked sometimes, and I don't know, I can probably count on one hand maybe the number of people who have had that giving record book. Nancy, I know you did it for some time. I had Mrs. Taylor, Eleanor Taylor, I think Beth Taylor, Doris Sansa did it. I've gone through a lot of treasurers through the years. Dave Mason is the treasurer now, but Cindy Nichols is the one that records all this stuff every Sunday after church. The only question I might ask sometimes, you know, I might ask in regards to something specific, you know, if people are giving to, and I don't ask who, but a specific amount of money. Or Cindy called me in, she usually down here Sundays, right after church, because that money doesn't linger. Well, I'm telling you, it comes in Sunday, it's in the bank on Monday. And she might even drop it in the drop box Sunday night, I don't know, but it goes quickly. And sometimes she'll get a check for something or something. She had one Sunday, and it was a gift. She said, I'm not sure where to tell Dave to put this. And I said, what does it say on it? She said, well, it said for the Ireland mission trip. I said, well, tell her to put it for the Ireland mission trip. I said, as simple as that. I said, that's what it's designated for, designated there. You know, and of course, she's been watching. We got the sweatshirts and everything, and I told some of the folks, I said, well, you can either give me the money, which again, you give it to me, I get it in an envelope and get it in the box, so Cindy can get it right in the bag. But Cindy was keeping track, so I could mark off the ones who had paid. And so she gave that to me Sunday as well. When we've considered people for leadership here, I never asked for specifics. My question has always been, is there a consistency to the giving? You know, because I think that's important if you're going to be in leadership in the church. And so that's really the only way. And again, I'm interested in the cumulative totals. And I want to know what we give as a congregation, because it speaks of our church's love for Christ and building his kingdom. So it's important to know that. And again, it just always amazes me. And so voluntarily, faithfully, proportionally, expectantly, submissively, trustingly, lovingly. And then we see we are to give as an example. That's when we move into the 9th chapter, verses 1 through 4. It says, for it was superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely the Achaia, has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I have sent the brother in order that our boasting about you may not be made empty in this case, so that, as I was saying, you may be prepared. Otherwise, if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we will not speak of you. We will be put to shame by this confidence. And so the word superfluous just simply means profitable. He says, I want things to be profitable here. And he says, I want to make sure that, when they come, you said you're going to do this, and we expect you to have it prepared, and we expect you to follow through on that. And so he's saying, look, we already established that fact a couple of weeks ago, that, the Macedonian churches are really the ones who have set the example for the Corinthians to follow. And he said, so look, when we come, if I got some of these Macedonians with us, make sure that you did what you said you're going to do, because we don't want to damage the testimony or be put to shame. Our giving sets an example for other people, certainly. I think, and I know it was in our house, that, children, your parents ought to be talking to the children about giving. That you ought to talk to them about it. I don't know, George, if you remember this or not. This was, Pastor Greg was here. I was just leading the music, I think. I don't know, maybe I was the pastor. I don't know, because I think Danny was only about 3 years old if he was that, 3 or 4. And I was in the pulpit, and I called for the men to take up the offering. And Danny came off the front pew. Do you remember that? Little fella, he came off the front pew, came around. I thought, where is he going? And he turned, he came up the steps right to me, incognito, I guess, thinking that, even though he's on the platform, he whispers, Dad, you didn't give me the offering. Man, I got you. It's, and I thought, yeah, that did me good. I thought, yeah, the boy wants to be involved. He wants to be involved in the offering. And that's what we taught our kids. You need to be involved in it. And hopefully as they got older and they started making their own money, instead of taking it out of my change dish and everything like that, My daughter was really good for that, going through the car ashtray. Well, cars don't have ashtrays anymore, I guess. I've had some cars with ashtrays, but I used to throw change in there, right? And I'll never forget when Hayden and I were in Nigeria in 2008. We got there. I hadn't exchanged any currency before I got there, because the missionaries told me, they said, look, when you get here, we'll do some currency exchange for you. It's the cheapest way for you to do this. You try to do this prior to coming, even in the airports, the exchange rate, it fluctuates and all the rest of it, so just wait till you're here. And so Pastor Zach was going to do that for me. And so it was the first Sunday that I was there, and we were in North Kaduna. And it was just an overwhelming experience to begin with. As I mentioned, it was probably, I have a picture of it at my office, and the picture doesn't do it justice, because there was over 1,600 people in this service. The church probably sat about 900. The rest of them were in plastic chairs along the shady side of the building. And of course, the windows were just that. They were windows. They didn't have any glass or anything in them, so that was just open. And some of these people walked a couple of hours to come to church. The Sunday we were there, the pastor, his name is Zach. I think he's Stephen Bahago's brother-in-law, as a matter of fact. He was living in an undisclosed location because the Muslims had burnt the parsonage down twice. So that was the kind of thing we were going into there. But I'm sitting up on the platform, and I didn't bring any money with me. I had it locked away, or Zach's had it. I think, yeah, whatever I had, Zach's had. I'm waiting for him to change it, right? And so they're going to start taking an offering. And the guy next to me leans over and he hands me some money to put in the offering plate. Yeah, I feel like a little kid again. Thank you. I can participate. But he thought it was important that I participated in the offering. Oh, that's good. So I was so glad when I got that money exchanged, and I was able to go ahead and everywhere we went, they took up offerings. And I did the same thing. We were in Kenya, certainly for the church offering, but as many of you know, I really didn't get engaged as much with the Bible school. I knew that I couldn't. It just made sense to travel with that group than to make my own travel arrangements. And but Pastor Danny was taking me all different places every day. And one morning prior to Bible school, we wound up back over at the Bible school in the afternoon, but we went to this place where it was a group of pastors in that local Diani area. And they have a special offering. They were meeting. I forget what the frequency of these meetings were, but it was a rented place, and they were trying to see if they could find a place that they could, at least a piece of land to purchase and somewhere that they could could have as their own to me. And so they were taking a special offering for them. I was happy that I could be a part of that special offering, you know. And but parents all teach their children. You know, certainly people who have experienced the blessings of stewardship can be helpful in relieving some of the fears of people who are just getting into it, because it can be kind of a fearful thing. And so we ought to be helpful that way as well. And then number 9, the last description. I didn't miss any, did I, Greg? Okay. Yeah. Last week I skipped one, had to come back. So that's why it's great when you preach without people having your outline in front of you. It's one of the greatest disciplines in the world for me to do that, and PowerPoints and stuff, because now I got to be disciplined as well. But number 9, we are to give unselfishly. We are told not to be covetousness and selfish, but to give willingly to the Lord. Verse 5, chapter 9. So I thought it necessary to urge you, brethren, that they would go on ahead to you and arrange beforehand your previously promised bountiful gift, so that the same would be ready as a bountiful gift and not affected by covetousness. Now I wonder why he would say that. You know, you got all this money stored up. There it is. You say, well, we set that money aside for this gift going to Jerusalem. But man, we sprung a leak Sunday in the roof. Would that be covetousness? It would be, isn't it? Because you've already designated that money for something else. And of course, we understand that covetousness is not unfamiliar to us. 10th commandment of the 10 commandments, Exodus 20:17, you shall not cover your neighbor's house, you shall not cover your neighbor's wife, or his male servant or female servant, or his ox or his donkey, or anything that belongs to him. And to covet simply means to desire something that belongs to someone else. Specifically, it means not desiring one like what they have, but the one that they actually have. And so the idea of the fact is, he equates this idea of stewardship by designating or setting aside a specific gift for the work of God. And of course, what's Malachi? The question to Malachi, will a man rob God? That's really what you're doing. If you set this aside and then all of a sudden you start having second thought, you're robbing God now, because it belongs, well, really all belongs to him, but it's what you've designated to him. And so covetousness is really a mark of depravity. And Jesus said in Mark 7:21-22, he said, from within, out of the heart of man proceed deeds of coveting and wickedness. And he speaks to this subject all throughout the New Testament, 2 Peter and Ephesians and Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, and even in the Psalms, and so much in regards to that. And so it's important to understand the nature of that. One illustration I read said this: it's the fool in the art gallery that thought because he carried the painting that it belonged to him. You know, no, that's not the way it works. And so we have a great responsibility. One last little thing here, and we'll wrap this up for tonight. Sunday school teacher asked her 8 eager 10-year-olds if they would give $1 million to missions. And everybody, yes, they screamed. She said, well, would you give $1,000? Again, they shouted yes. Well, what about $100? Oh, yes, we would. They all agreed. And she said, would you give just $1 to missions? And she was surprised that everybody said yes, but one little boy. She said, you were so ready to give. What happened? He said, well, I have $1. You know, see, that's the difference. I have $1. I was talking to somebody about that recently. I said, you know, that's a big difference. I said, big difference between giving a dime on $1 and having $1 million and, yeah, whatever 10% of that is. But anyway, what's that, 100,000? Move the decimal points. So, but that's the reality of it sometimes, you know. It may be a lot easier to give when you have less than when you have more. And but this whole importance of stewardship it is it's a mark of maturity of the believers. It's the idea of the fact that we recognize that as Christians, we're not owners, but we're just simply managers of what God allows us to have. And we're going to see next week, and you've heard me talk about it before, is the idea that one of the reasons that God blesses us through our giving, he blesses us so that we can be a greater blessing. It's not about trying to accumulate wealth. I think I said it last week, it's not, stewardship is not like the stock market, we're not trying to make a profit off of it. That's not what it is. God will bless us in multiple different ways through the faithfulness of our giving, through the local church. And so, what a great example, and what a beautiful picture that the apostle paints of these 9 things that were true of the example and the gifts of the Macedonians. And what an exciting thing to realize. Here was another church, Corinth, said, you know what? We heard about this. We want to get in on it too. Let us be a part of it as well. And it's an exciting thing to be able to be a part of building the kingdom of God. And listen, when we understand that, it's exactly what it is. It's a kingdom. It goes far beyond what we're just doing here, And I'm looking forward tomorrow. I've got a video call coming from Doug Staley. We're going to be talking more. I've got to get the email out. Yesterday, he emailed me the itinerary for our Ireland trip. So everything we're doing, all our sightseeing, our meals, the whole thing is laid out. Boy, that's right in my wheelhouse. Now, I don't know what an Ireland itinerary is like compared to. I still have it on my computer. My Nigerian itinerary. Throw that thing out the window. I was scheduled to do a couple pastors' conferences and preach in a couple different churches, and then by the time it was done, I preached 21 times in 10 days, man. That was not on the itinerary, but I'll tell you what, I enjoyed every minute of it, and was so glad for it. But yeah, I'm excited that. But it's partnerships like that, realizing, we ought to be excited about what God's doing in other places. And I'll tell you that story. I told the fella, Blake was his name, right? We met this fella, Blake. He was from Kansas City, Missouri. I'm assuming Missouri, but Kansas City. He was a Chiefs fan. So I come down to breakfast one morning at the hotel. George already had him warmed up. Yeah. And so I sat down with him, and then George went back up to some schoolwork, whatever, and I picked up where he left off. And I just had a delight talking to this gentleman and everything. And we were exchanging sayings from different things we like. And I told him, I said, you ever heard of Adrian Rogers? He said, yeah. He said, I know Adrian Rogers. I said, yeah. I said, I'll tell you what, I said, one of my favorite stories of him, and I've told it here a dozen times, but I said, it's applicable. I said, he tells the story of a rooster who went and traveled the world. And he said in his travels, he experienced a lot of different things. When he got back to his home and he got to the hen house, he came into the brood of hens, and he brought with him an ostrich egg. And he said, girls, I want you to know that I'm not finding fault with what you're doing, but I want you to see what they're doing in other places. That's pretty amazing, right? I think that's what's encouraging to us when we realize what God's doing in other places. And when we invest our resources, it's great when we can invest our time and our energy into it. But knowing that when we are willing to make sure that, like this was for the sake of the Jerusalem church, these other churches got on board. We've done that so many different ways. There was a church in Millville. It was there, 10th and not even 10th Street. What was it? No, Mount Pleasant was the other one, but there was one. No, it was on Broad Street. Broad Street. What's that? Yes, yeah. They had a fire. Yeah, we helped them out. Mount Pleasant Methodist got struck by lightning, and the pastor there, I haven't talked to him in years now, but he was a dear friend of mine, John Mitchell. He pastored down here at Cedarville United Methodist. John's old school Methodist, man. That's why they kept moving him around. They didn't like dealing with him too much. But boy, what a godly man. But their church got struck by lightning. You know what? Insurance paid to rebuild the building, but they lost everything. And we had an extra piano. We gave them a piano. Funeral home gave them an organ, you know. And I thought, boy, that, churches are stepping up and saying, look, okay, you need this. We're going to help you out with that. We helped the interim pastor out from Dividing Creek after Dividing Creek had a fire in the parsonage there, And I'm sure, I would expect that they would do the same for us if we had a problem. I remember years ago, some of you remember Francis Champion. Mm-hmm. Oh man, I tell you what, he was character, man. He was all right, I was at a post office one time. I was in there, and Father Bill Blyer came in from the parish down here in Cedarville, and I remember Champ going and said, "Hey, Father, how's the wife and kids?" He said, "Oh, I'm sorry, you don't do that." Him and I are having lunch in Dino's at the time, and he stands up and introduces me as the pastor of the largest Baptist church in Cedarville. I remember one Sunday morning, man, he called me one Sunday morning. He said, "Oh, we're supposed to have communion." He said, "I got bread, but I got no cups." I said, "Come on up. I got about 5,000 of them." I said, "How many do you need?" I said, "He's just give me a sleeve." He said, "That'll keep me for the rest of the year." So, but it's that kind of stuff that we're just, if we can help out. I mentioned some of you. Monday night I went out with my in-laws. They have the trailer down there in the landing there in Newport, so they usually come down beginning of most weeks. And so Brad and I usually go up there Monday nights, and then so we wound up going to Morris River Diner with my in-laws. And I see this gentleman walking over to me, and it was like, "I know you. Who was it?" Well, it was Pastor Doug Cheney. And Miss Pam was with him, and they were with the Lords. They were having dinner. So I guess he was up here for the church's anniversary, But I remember, as God was calling Pastor Cheney away. Pastor's heart, man, you just don't want to leave your people flat. He was trying to cover all the bases he possibly could to help them out as much as possible. And one of the things was where the music was concerned. I said, "Well, look," I said, I have got a good library of piano hymn music. And so I got that all compiled for him and run that down to him and everything. Yes, this is what we do. This is what churches ought to do. It's what we ought to do. That's all part of stewardship. And that's exactly what's happening in chapters 8 and 9. And it lays the groundwork for these lessons of how to be a good steward, not just individually, but collectively as part of the body of Christ. All right, well, let's pray. Father, thank you for this time of study. Lord, I pray that you would just impress upon our hearts the importance of the role that we play just by simply by being part of the local church, God, because collectively there is much that we do. But Lord, of course, it is reflected in the church collectively as we submit ourselves individually and follow the examples and the principles that have been set forth before us. God, I thank you for the blessings that abound because of faithful stewardship. And God, we know you are the good giver of great gifts. And God, thank you for the blessings that you bestow upon us in Jesus' name.